back in my young days, we plowed all the ground. You had to plow all your ground. You didn't have the chemicals, so you plowed all the ground, and then you would disc it, and then you would harrow it. And when you planted it, we had well, back a little farther up when I was a boy, they planted 2 rows, and they had wire, would put it at one end of the field with a stake, and wire up the other end of the field with a stake. And this wire would go through the planter, and there'd be like a knot tied every so far on it, and that was what would cause the planter to trip three kernels of corn in each spot. And then you would, after the corn got a little taller, there's no chemicals, so you cultivated it with a cultivator on your tractor, and you had shields on your cultivator, like rakes that would plow the ground to take the weeds out, and there'd be metal shields on each side of where this row would go, so when the corn was little, the dirt didn't fall in and mash the corn over. So you'd go the direction that you planted it that time, and then a little bit later, the corn got taller, well, you would go across it. You would cross it, so you'd go bumpity bump across those ridges that you made when you're cultivating the weeds out. And then you'd go the third time back the original direction, the way it was planted. And that's how you did it, because there was no chemicals to put on it. And then we had little tractors, of course, and my dad bought a brand new 504 when I was a boy. It was a big tractor in those days, and it had a 3-bottom plow on it that you plowed all the fields with. My first, when I first started farming on my own, I had a little Ford tractor and a 2-mounted plow on it, and you have to plow everything. We'd had a 1-row picker that you pulled behind your tractor to pick 1 row of corn. As time went on, we got a 2-row picker. They had them that you pulled them, and then if you really was fancy, which we thought we were at that time, well, we got a 2-row mounted picker. It mounted right on your tractor, on each side of your tractor, and you drove down through the middle of the row, and that picked ear corn. There wasn't any such thing as shelled corn in those days. And then as time went on, we got a sheller that would mount on the back of the 2-row mounted corn picker, and the ears would come up, each row would come up the sides of the tractor, and in this sheller on the back of the tractor, then it would shell the corn off the corn cobs, and the shelled corn would go up the elevator and drop over into a wagon, and then you'd bring it in and put it into a bin. And that was a 2-row mounted picker. We was really making time then. Time went on, then they come out with a 4-row corn picker, and boy, we thought we were really getting something done then, picking 4 rows at a time. Yeah. And my dad and my brother and I would all take turns to keep this planter going. We wouldn't stop for breakfast, dinner, or supper. We would keep rotating, each one of us, so that we could keep the corn planter running. Take turns eating breakfast or dinner or supper to keep the planter going. And then times changed again, and they come out with 6-row corn planter, planting 6 rows at a time. And we kind of did the same thing. Zach's dad and I both had a 6-row corn planter at that time, and for a few years, well, we followed each other around in the field with 6 rows behind each other. So we were planting 12 rows of corn, and boy, we thought we were really making progress doing that. Well, now they've come out with 36-row planters.
And the 48.
And the 48-row corn planter. Back when I was a young boy, the neighbor over here they had tractors that had iron wheels on them, and on the back wheels they had like lugs, like a spike that would stick down in the ground, and that's how they got their traction. And the front tires were metal also, and it was a big thing in our neighborhood. They came out and they switched it over when I was still young to rubber tires on the front and the back. And the neighbors all over the neighborhood came to see this be switched over and be rubber going on the ground, so he could drive it down his driveway and down the roads and so forth. The roads were all rock roads. Wasn't any such thing as blacktop or concrete around here. Even in the town of Norwalk, there wasn't any paved roads. It was all rock.
Wow.
And so it was a big thing when it switched over to rubber tires.
What about the width of the rows? Have they changed a lot?
They've changed a lot. It used to be a 38-inch wide row, and a little bit later they kind of get into like a 36-inch row, and now down into like 30-inch rows, and now there's some trying a double row and a 20-inch row, two rows together, and then 20-inch spacing in between them. So that's how times have changed. But the yields have greatly changed too, and the seeds have greatly changed, and now you get high yields. In those days, if you got 60 bushels or 80 bushel an acre, you were really getting a big yield, but you didn't have the fertilizers or the chemicals, and either one to help with crops back at that time either.
Yeah.
And if you had fertilizer, if you had cows, well, that's how you got the fertilizer on the ground, spreading the manure out on the fields.
What's the biggest difference in your opinion on how farming's progressed?
Well, there's several different things. Like we said, the seeds have really progressed, the fertilizers and chemicals, they've all really progressed, and the machinery. It's you could win the lottery and spend it all on machinery, the way that's progressed, because every time you turn around they make something bigger and better. So that's really progressed, from going from like a 1 and a 2 row picker to now a 12.
If you were a boy and I told you about how much chemical and fertilizer we'd put down on the ground and how easy it is now to keep your field under control, would you be surprised?
Oh yes, yes. I would have never dreamed that you could control weeds like they do now, and the yields that you can get out of the fields. And that's how we feed all the nations, by all the seeds and the yields that you get off of there now. Oh, if your corn was knee-high by the 4th of July, you really had done really well, because a lot of corn didn't make it to knee-high by the 4th of July. So now if corn isn't shoulder-high or so, you feel like you're a failure.
Yeah. What about soybeans? Have soybeans progressed a lot too, or?
Oh, they have. It used to be if you got 15 bushel or even 20 bushel, you felt you did very good. And later in years, well, if you had 30 bushel yield, well, you were just really tickled. You really had a high yield. But now if you get 50 bushel, well, you're really happy. It's difference in the seed and the rotation of corn and beans in the crops. And it's just really changed. I never dreamed we'd ever get to this point. When I was a kid, it was just an automatic that you did these things. When I was a kid, well, I worked all summer long out for mostly other farmers, because everything was baled hay. You didn't have the big round bales that they have now. So I'd spend one summer riding on the back of a baler. You used to tie it by wire, and one person would poke the wire on each side of the back of the baler. You'd pull it with a tractor and a baler. Well, you'd mow the hay, then you'd come and you'd rake the hay into a windrow, and then the tractor and baler would come along and make square bales. And it'd take one person on the tractor and 2 people riding on the baler, one to push the wire through and the other to pull it through and tie the end of the wire, and it would drop it on the ground. And then later we would come back, and several of us, and one person drive the tractor, and the others, we would pick up the bales and throw in the rack, and there'd be 1 or 2 people on the rack stacking the bales on the hay rack. And we'd take it to the barn, and you had a couple different methods of putting it in the barn. Probably the biggest one back at that time was a hay mow, where you'd have a track going across the top in your barn, and a rope that would let this fork come down and grab onto several bales, and then there'd be a rope and a tractor up on the other end, or horses, and they would yell at him, and he would go forward, and that would make that lift up and go across into the hay mow, hit the track and go across in the hay mow. And he had another rope that would drop the bales. When he got to a certain point, he would jerk the rope, and that would trip it and drop the bales to where it was, and then you would stack them in there. Well, a little later in time, it kind of changed. People went to using big wide elevators, and they pulled a tractor and a hay rack with a square bales on it up next to it, and you'd put the hay bales onto this elevator, and it would squeak and so forth, and take the bales up and drop them in the barn. Then you'd have several young fellows, like I was, and we'd stack them in the barn for them to feed the cows.
Yeah, it's kind of a big difference today when you have big round bales. It seems like that, or the new thing is the bigger squares, but 2,000 pounds. It's a little different.
Yes, yeah, there's hardly anybody that does anything with square bales anymore. It's such labor intensive.
Yeah.
So now you have the big round balers that make the 2,000 pound bales. Like you said, some square bales, but the bigger majority is the big round ones, I would say.
You ever imagine when you were a kid, when you were running around with the like a 100-horse tractor? You know, you thinking you're biggest tractor in the world, and you turn around today and there's a 70-horse case that came out this year.
Yeah, no, I'd have never dreamed this. This 504 that was my dad's tractor, I just restored it, and I think it was probably 35 horse. And we thought that was a pretty good tractor in that day. And later, after I was out on my own and was married, well, I bought the biggest tractor in the community around here. It was a 706 International tractor, and it was on a diesel, and you pulled a 5-bottom plow. It really should have had a 4-bottom on it because it was too much of a load for it. But that I don't remember how many horsepower that was, but we thought that was really something in those days to have a tractor that size. Well, now it wouldn't even make a good feedlot tractor. It's small enough, but it was big for that day.
Would you ever have dreamed that you guys would ever farm as much as you do, and there wouldn't be as many farmers when you were a kid? Because it seemed like there for a while, it just seemed like everyone was coming out of the farm, and I mean, it seems like the acres are just slowly condensing into a few farmers and not a lot.
Yeah. No, you'd have never dreamed that farms got as big as they are now, but the equipment got bigger, and it made it so you could farm a lot more acres. For quite a few years, there wasn't very much money to be made in farming, and so many of the boys and a lot of the farmers quit and went to town and found a job and worked. The last few years it's been better, but now you do have to farm a lot of acres, and the cost is really high. You have to have a good banker. It's very hard for a young person to ever get started into farming because of the cost of it, unless his dad or his grandpa or somebody is in this business to help him. It's just terrible high cost of machinery. You never dreamed you'd spend $350,000 for a combine or something. Where Willard Freeze lives, right west of town, he farmed that farm, but he had a couple of horses, and he would take these horses and he'd harrow the ground. The ground would be cloddy, and he'd put like 3 harrows back behind these horses, and he'd put a couple 2x12s across these harrows and have us boys ride along with him. We'd ride all day on that. It was good for him because it would help put weight on the harrows to mash down the clods. The horses would walk along and pull the harrows. We'd ride on it all day long, and then at the end of the day, he would stop up, which would be, well, a little while back, they used to have the brick building right at the top of the hill. We had Easter Store up there, which is now the bank. You had a little building called Crow Store. There's two widow ladies that had a store, and he'd stop and he'd buy us a big bottle of Pepsi, and we thought that was really something, getting a bottle of Pepsi. But we'd ride on that all day long, just covered with dirt from being back behind the horses. But then he kept an old cow there that he'd milk, and we had milk that you drank.